This video is all about Flex container properties. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to demonstrate understanding of Flex container properties in Flexbox. So before we dive in, we need to know all about the rules and properties that are associated with our containers that we have declared as Flex containers. Remember, Flex applies styles to the parent container, and children start behaving differently as a result. We have Flex containers and we have Flex items. Whichever element gets the display Flex property, that element becomes the Flex container. And then all nested elements become the Flex items. So this is review. You should have already seen this from the previous model. So the following is a list of items, a list of properties that we can use to style our Flex containers. The first one is called Flex direction. All Flex modules follow a general direction for content to flow. This direction is known as what we call the main axis. So the direction of flow is known as the main axis. We can control the main axis with Flex direction. The default direction is what we call row. So we saw that in our previous example when we laid things out and we changed the default from the default to column. There's two different types of directions. It's direction of row or direction of column. So if we set our container to Flex direction of row, our content will flow from left to right. This is also the default, so it's not something you actually have to explicitly set. The next flow will be from right to left. If we change our direction to row reverse, our content is going to be flipped, and our container flips, and the items also start from right to left. It's really, really fun. Next, we have column. Main axis will flow from top to bottom. It's pretty straightforward. We actually saw that in our previous together example that we did. And then the last one, of course, is column reverse. So the main axis will flow from bottom to top. Pretty straightforward. So that is Flex direction. Remember, the default is row. So let's look at what we can do to change and manipulate content from within a container. Oftentimes, Flex items will actually run over our content within the container space. When this happens, we can actually use Flex wrap. The default to Flex wrap is no wrap. Default will be that containers try and contain their content. So you can think of it this way. Anytime you have a Flex container or a container in general, the idea is that that container wants to manipulate and control its children. It really wants its children to do exactly what they're told to do. So the default behavior is that it's going to try and contain and constrain those children within the walls of the container. So one thing we can do is we can actually control the default behavior to allow for our items to wrap instead of being contained. And this is really, really powerful, especially when designing content for things like grid systems and things like that. When you have an unknown amount of items that are going to be printed to the screen. So let's look at how we can utilize Flex wrap to get the job done here. The default value, once again, is no wrap, meaning our content is going to try and be constrained to the container, which means, of course, that it's going to potentially look ugly if we have a ton of items in our container. So if we change it to wrap, we can wrap the content from top to bottom. So as soon as a Flex item hits the bounds of the container, it's just going to wrap to the next item. And then, of course, we have things like wrap reverse, which is going to change the reversal of those of the wrapping. Okay. So we've learned about direction, which is the dynamic sort of flow of where things go, the direction of our content. And then we've learned about wrap, how to sort of put that, the flow with, and allow it to flow outside of the constraints of a container. Now we're going to learn a shorthand for both of those called Flex flow. And simply put, Flex flow is just a shorthand version for Flex direction and Flex wrap. So there's not a ton to learn here that we don't already know. The idea is that you can change your content to go into FlexFlow to row wrap. So you can select both of those items at the same time, which is really nice. And then of course you can do column and no wrap, or column wrap, or whatever. All right, now that we know how to change the direction and the flow of our content, we can manipulate the way that our items lay out. We need to learn about spacing within our items. And we do that with justify content. When you see the word justify in a Flexbox module, start thinking main axis. Anytime we want to style flex items on the main axis, we can use justify content to get the job done. You'll see values with justify content like space around and space between. The idea is we want you to, as soon as you're done with this, go ahead and read up on those and play around with them yourself so you can see the difference between space around and space between. And we're going to do a little example together in a few minutes that go over that idea. So let's take a look at what we can use with justify content. So the default value for justify content is that we have what's called a flex start. So it places the content at the start point of the main axis within the container. We can change that by using what's called flex end. We can also use center, which will center the content. We can use space between, which will provide an even amount of space between each item on the main axis. And we can use space around to provide space around each item on the main axis. And then of course we have what's called space evenly, which can provide space around each item on the main axis as well. And that's going to provide it evenly. So you can start to see the power of all of these and how easy it is to take content from one sort of direction and then justify it so that it centers within the middle of a container, it spaces out properly within a container, things like that. So there's also something we can use to not only space content out around the main axis, but also on what's called the cross axis, and that is align items. So we know how to adjust flex items on the main axis using justify content. But what happens when we want to use the cross axis or the up and down vertical axis? So remember that the cross axis is actually perpendicular to the main axis. If we look at our containers as a grid system, we have a cross axis and a main axis. You can think of a graph, like in mathematics. A cross axis would be the y, the up and down. And then the x-axis, the main axis, would be the x-axis, like the right and left. Okay, the horizontal. So anytime we see the word align, our brain should start thinking cross-axis. So justify should be main axis, align should be cross-axis. Let's take a look at what align items, the values of align item prop that we can use. Okay, so it can come as a surprise to some that stretch is the default value for align items. Stretch will literally stretch an item's white space to fill the full flex container. Okay, so this is the default behavior, stretch. Ways to override that are with flex start and flex end. So you can place them at the start or end of the cross axis. Also, we have center. And of course, we have baseline. Center, all items are placed at the center of the cross axis. And then baseline, all flex items align with the bottom base of their text content on the cross axis. Remember, we're going to play around with these examples in just a minute, so don't worry about soaking all this in. Plus, I don't even have all these memorized. I still use cheat sheets all the time. Flexbox gives us so much power, and there's so many properties to understand. It's just a high-level understanding and a vision of all these that you need in order to get started. So now that we know a little bit about how we can get things to flow within our containers, cross axes and main axes, let's look at align content. Align content is similar to how justify content works on the main axis, but align content controls white space for multiple lines of flex items across the cross axis. The cross axis, remember, is perpendicular to the main axis. Anytime we see the word align, we should start to think cross axis. So let's see what we have with align content. The default, once again, will be stretch. Okay. Then we have, of course, flex start, center, end, space between, and space around. Where flex start is items are placed at the starting point of the cross axis. Flex end is, you got it, the ending point. And then center, of course, is the center of the cross axis. And space between and space around are evenly spacing, once again, our content. So align content is necessary for providing things and pushing them up and down that cross axis, and then changing their direction and playing around with them. Once again, you don't need to memorize all this. You just need to see how it works within the ecosystem, and then you can use cheat sheets for the rest of your life. So what's cool about Flexbox is it's not unlike other ideas. It's not unlike other paradigms within CSS. You can use multiple properties when using Flexbox. We do have to caveat and say it is pretty overwhelming at first to see the amount of properties that can be used in Flexbox. The great news is you only need one property and value to get some amazing results. For example, centering something horizontally and vertically becomes trivial with Flex. You can also mix and match properties and achieve some powerful layout concepts really quickly. Flexbox still respects the box model, so you can use all of your hard-earned CSS skills together with Flexbox to create layouts that every designer will love. So here's an example. If we want to center our content, we could justify the content center, can align items center, and we're ready to go. Notice how we combine some properties to get very trivial amount of code to do some powerful things. This is what Flexbox is good for, using power within our reaches at our fingertips to drive these concepts home, to lay out our content, to make our designers very, very happy. But now we need to dive in. We need to take a look at some code because that's the best place to learn about Flexbox. So go ahead, there is a follow along exercise in Training Kit. I want you to copy and paste the items from there, and we'll get started over in a CodePen or a text editor of your choice. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do here, we're going to play around with these this container with these items just like we had done before. But we're going to continue to extend this and play around with some more items. We're going to add a bunch of items to this container. We're going to see what Flexbox does for us. So remember, flex direction is the default for all Flex containers. Just by saying display flex, this is defaulted here. I could delete that and we would achieve the exact same results. So let's take a look at our flex direction, the general direction for the flow of our content. Let's change it to row reverse and see what happens to our items. This is really crazy. Notice that you probably didn't really expect this to happen. Not only did we flip where our container is lined up on the screen all the way from the left to the right, but the items within that container flow from right to left. So the first item, if you're reading this like you would, the English language, is going, from left to right would be the reverse of our content. Notice we're labeling all of these divs as a result so that we can see that 1, 2, 3, 4 is top to bottom, right? So really powerful. All I had to do was change the direction and we flipped our axis. We flipped our container. We could also do this with column as well. 4, 3, 2, 1. Or if we go back to the default column, it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4. So really, really powerful stuff. Really important to understand that this is super duper powerful. So let's take this now and let's add a bunch of items to our container. Inside of Training Kit in the follow along portion, you can find another bunch of divs and you can just copy and paste those in right here. And let's take our column, and instead of being a column, we're going to go back to row. And let's constrain this a little bit by understanding what's going on here. We expected these to be boxes, squares, not rectangles, because they are 50 by 50 pixels. If we really wanted to see how ugly this can get, we could, kind of change this and notice that it's not respecting the width of our items. Our items are 150 pixels, and our container is trying to constrain those children. But our children have outgrown the container. So for this, we're going to use flex wrap. Okay, so we're going to keep our flex direction as row, and we're going to add flex wrap. And the default, remember, is no wrap. Remember that from the slide. So this is already happening because by default, flex containers are no wraps. But what happens if we actually add it as wrap? Check it out. Immediately, our container starts to respect the items a little bit more and says, hey, I think I can provide you with some really important concepts here. And the concept is that I'm going to let you overflow. I'm going to let you reach the end of my container, and then I'm going to push your content to the next row in a very even fashion. Notice that there is the same amount of pixels, top, bottom, left, right, around our entire content. So how easy was that to build a little grid system? And notice that as our browser shrinks, it's very responsive. As our container gets smaller in width, our items instantly wrap. This is the power of Flexbox. There is immediate benefit to Flexbox within the realm of responsive design. So it's very important that you understand that Flexbox provides you with some responsive tools out of the box. So if you were to browse this website on mobile, you would see that a very small width screen would respect that content really, really nicely. You're going to learn all about responsive design next week, but that's just sort of a tidbit into the future of what you're going to be learning. Let's look at the wrap reverse so we can get an idea of what our items do. And notice that it changed things, but we started down here, item 1, 2, 3, 4, and then wrapped up 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So it's still reading right to left because our direction is telling it to, but we reversed it and now it's kind of climbing up the ladder, so to speak. Really, really nicely. So this is awesome, but a little bit cumbersome. So I'm just going to flex flow, the shorthand, and we're going to say row wrap. There we go. Okay. Now that we have these items in here, we're kind of understanding the power of wraps and directions. Let's look at justify content. Justify content is easily one of the harder ones to explain, but let's delete roughly a little bit over half of these items. And I'm going to go back to 50 pixels a piece so that we can kind of see that there's some extra space here. Notice that our container, because it's a div and we haven't constrained the width of our actual container, it spans the entire width of the screen. But these items are all just sort of lumped together from right to left. So remember, Flex gives us what's called justify content. And what's the keyword that is triggering in your brain when you see justify content? Well, it should be main axis. And if we say flex start, that is the default, okay? But we can switch our justification of content by going to flex end. And virtually, we didn't reverse our content. It's just respecting the end instead, with our items going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So just like in a Word document, you can go and justify left, center, and right. You can do the same with justify content. So if you were to say justify content center, it would center our items across the screen. See how easy and powerful this is, gang? This makes your life so much nicer. Now, what if we want to span our content across the whole screen and respect gutters between our items? Well, there's a really simple way to do that. And the way that I like to do that is just saying justify content space between. And notice that there's an even amount of space between our elements. Really nifty for easy, simple layout. And then if we wanted to respect not just the space between elements, but the space around elements, we could see that it'll respect the left and right. So all of our items are centered and evenly spaced within our content. And look, I'm just simply changing one simple property. It's so easy to get that put together. And then one of the better ones out there today is called space evenly. And it's going to look a lot like the others, or space where there was space around. But space evenly will respect around each item on the main axis and keep it nice and even, which is really, really, really cool. Okay, so now that we've kind of learned about spacing things out along the main axis, or sort of that X plane, let's look at how we can space things out along the Y axis. We have these 5 elements, and we're going to tweak our HTML. If you don't want to follow along with me, a copy of this will be found in your training kit, so you can go ahead and copy and paste. But it is worth it to sort of tweak things and play around with things. So I'm going to add some more content to a couple of our divs, so that you can kind of see some dynamic content happen. I'm just going to say item A here, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the 3rd div as well. Just kind of break the space and add item B. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the height from our items so that our containers will respect their content. And now we're going to watch the behavior of align items very thoroughly, because this is where things start to get really, really cool. So I'm gonna ignore the space between justification for now, and notice that we have no height on our items, right? Our divs that are with the class name of item. But what the weird thing is that's happening is that as this grows on, because we have new content here, our items that don't have any content are growing as well. So my assumption is that if I were to add a few extra things here, notice that all of our content is being respected. All of our items, our containers, are sort of stretching to fill that cross-axis. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to overwrite that behavior. And the way to do that is with align items. And align items is going to default to stretch. So by default, all Flex containers are defaulted to align item stretch. If I were to change this to Flex start, we would actually start to respect the children elements. So Flex start will start respecting the behavior of those elements. So the content here is less than the content here and inside of this box. And as a result, our items are just now defaulting across the cross-axis to the start of that cross-axis from the top to bottom. So if I wanted to change that and go end, you would see that would shift it down. So really nice way to align your items across that cross-axis in a very dynamic fashion. You could do the same thing with center. And that's going to sort of just kind of respect things traditionally. And then baseline, I'm not sure exactly what we're going to achieve with baseline here. It looks like there's not much to tweak there, but you can go ahead and look at definitely a bunch of examples that are out there, within the Flexbox ecosystem. And remember, you don't need to memorize all these things. It's just super important to understand the power of what you get out of the box with Flexbox. Okay. Now, the last thing we're going to look at is what's called align content. Align content will not work unless you have multiple lines of Flex items to style. If you only have one line of Flex items, you won't see any changes. And the best example that you could use to play around with this is actually found on CodePen. And it comes from Mozilla, so you can go ahead and check this out. And the link to this is found in your training kit. So notice that you can go ahead and play around with this little environment here and sort of tweak things the way that you want. And notice that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. If I were to play around with the way that these boxes line up across that justified axis, you'd be able to see that our content gets pushed up and down depending on our aligned content. So this is tweaking the properties. If we space evenly, you can kind of see that it respects borders top and right. You can do a baseline. You can go back to there's so many things, folks. So many things to play around with and tweak. But that's kind of the idea here. Is remember, align content is sort of like justify content, but then it's for the cross axis. Whereas align item is sort of respecting the up and down, the cross axis of the items within. So go ahead and tweak and play around with this code pen. We're going to grab it and make sure you have the example available to you in Training Kit so that you can definitely see and visualize the way that things come together. Once again, the biggest caveat and the biggest piece of advice that I can give you while you're learning Flexbox is to just play around with Flexbox. As you continue to do so, your toolkit will sharpen, and your tools will sharpen, and your toolkit will expand. And note that myself and Josh and the team here at Landis School and most developers, we don't have all of this stuff memorized. We constantly are referring to cheat sheets and items that are available to us. There are certain things that you just know because you use them over and over and over again. But then all this align content and align item stuff, I'm constantly referencing to remember how things flow. And once you use them, once you get used to playing around with them, your life becomes much, much better. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.